No, not at all. And I think this podcast, I mean, for those that are just tuning in, Philip Raeth, who's managing director at Paleos Healthcare, and his career is interesting because he's a PhD graduate, and there's a lot of you guys and gals watching that are PhD, but he seems to be what I always preached for people to do for their careers is to be generalists, not specialists. And everyone's going to start as a specialist somewhere. It's just by definition. You're not the Holy Spirit. You can't have occupy many jobs at once initially. So you're going to be put in one job that's a specialist, but your goal, in my opinion, is to expand your capability. And it's not common, Philip, to go from PhD to business development. Usually those skill sets are incongruent. I know many PhDs, actually, probably the majority of PhDs I've met, worked with, are not very social people. They're actually very awkward. They're very,
Mhm.
they stay to themselves. Their head is in the books. When they lift their head to see somebody that's very awkward conversation, then they go back to what they're doing. And in your case, I mean, I don't think you can become business development and be successful at it by being a recluse.
No, certainly not.
So who are you? Like, how do you do this?
Well, let me start with what I studied, and maybe there's a bit of the story hidden. So I studied business administration, like the classical route at the time. Like everyone, you think about what do I want to do in life? And I think when I had to make that decision, I wasn't very sure in terms of this is the job I want to do. There were like three things, four things that I considered because I thought they would be successful in terms of monetary, but also societal aspects, which was medicine, law, information technology, and business administration. These were kind of the routes that I had in my mind with like 16, 17, 18, whatever you're thinking at the time. And I ended up doing this business administration plus information systems direction because at the time I think it was 2002, three, the dot-com bubble was just over. And it was pretty clear to me IT will be important. So I didn't want to do a too technical thing. So I ended up doing this mix, right? So business administration with a focus on controlling and information systems or IT. And I studied this from 2003 to 2007, also staying in the US for a while. And the question at the time was also because essentially my background is very academic. I grew up in Heidelberg, which is an academic city. Everybody is involved, not everybody, a lot of people are involved in the new university or in the
It's the
research in some way,
it's the
right?
German equivalent of Boston, basically.
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah.
Probably a far away, but still, it's an important hub for life sciences, and
Mhm.
university is very big. And so the question for me was, do I want to go into academia or not? I wasn't sure at the time, so I did a PhD because I didn't want to end up in a situation that you don't do it and you basically have a hard stop in your career choices because that's not something that you can do when you're 40, right? Oh, it's very difficult, I'd say. I don't know
Right.
many people who do. Um, and so I then decided to do it's called an industry PhD. That's a literal translation. I don't know whether it exists in the English speaking language, but that's something that exists. So I basically would be at university 2 days a week, and three
Mhm.
days I was at IBM working on projects and essentially doing like the practical part of the research.
Yeah, yeah. They have similar thing. I forgot what they're called, but they have those things here too.
Yeah. And so at the same time, while I was doing the PhD, I got interested, I think also because it was on Vogue at the time,
Mhm.
in entrepreneurial questions. And there are several reasons for that. A, because my father and my stepmom had a company that they sold in 2005, a CRO,
They had
that
a
they
zero.
they
Okay.
had a
All
CRO,
right.
and my stepmother was the one that
Well,
founded
that
it in
answers my question
2020.
how you discovered the industry because
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. At the kitchen table, I heard a couple. Yeah. So at the same time, the entrepreneurial route, just, with all the internet stuff, you had Facebook coming up, all these kind of companies, that were more in a more attractive light with founders at the center of the story about these companies. And so I got interested in that. I did a couple of things, um, selling shoes online and other stuff that I did.
Wow.
And but none of them really successful, I must say. But
Yeah.
just entering the realm a bit and doing it when I was doing the PhD. In 2011, 12, around that time, I was just finishing my PhD, doing like the final touches and getting things in order and thinking about, what do you do next? I didn't want to go in academia. At the time, it was a very hard thing to do. It's in the US, you say, you're looking for tenure, and in Germany, it's similar. You're looking for the right way to essentially become a tenured professor because that's the best pathway, the most secure pathway for the future. But it's very competitive, it's very hard, and it's very low paid comparatively.
Of course.
And so I thought the entrepreneurial route is much more interesting. I didn't want to go into corporate. So most of the people I know from my school back in the day, they were going into investment banking or consulting. That was the big thing. Not many would go into industry, just later, but the first two kind of jobs you would take were in that space because it was well paid and it was a good entry ticket to whatever you want to do. They would take, let's say, the bright kid or bright lady, and then just basically school them. Um, and then you would move into whatever direction you would like in terms of industry or interest you would have. So
Right.
these were things that you could enter as a generalist coming from business administration. And so what happened at the same time is that my stepmother Renate, she kind of thought about and started a new CRO, right? She got out of the non-compete and she was free to do new things. And I got into a discussion with her. I don't remember how exactly, honestly, but it must have been about career choices
Hmm.
and the pathways that are open. And at the time, I had two things I was working on. I was helping her in that company a bit, like simple tasks, right? Just I knew I was helping them in documenting or double data entry and stuff like that before as a student, just to make money. So I had kind of some idea of the data management aspect. So I was doing similar things, and I had another thing that I was the founder, co-founder of a. I wasn't actually co-founder. I entered later to do finances for a company that was looking into e-mobility questions. So the idea was to rent motorbikes from China, electronic ones. But it didn't work out in the very beginning because the things were too clumsy at the time, and they didn't have the lean ones that Lime and so on came up with later. It was not working. So I had a discussion with her, and basically the idea was, okay, that it would be interesting to do something entrepreneurial together with you as a mentor, and basically with the chance of having somebody that has really seen a lot and successfully built a business and basically become her second hand, if you will,
Yeah.
and starting that as business development. Why business development? Essentially because I wasn't a medical, I was not a data manager, also, although I was closer. So I wasn't too familiar with the whole business uh, in detail. So the business development part, I couldn't do presentations, I could do the whole consulting education, if you will, from the business school helped because I was taught how to essentially draft or come up with a good argument. And that is great for doing proposals, right? Because in the end, you want to come up with a good story for the client, which is backed up by good arguments and leads the client through the question of why should you work with us? And so that's how I got into business, and that's how I started in business development.
Hmm.
And the business development part, I never left kind of I felt to be honest in the beginning that's not something that I had in mind for myself being a business development
Yeah.
but uh people always liked me doing it. So I stuck to it and it stuck with me. I did other things, and we can go into more detail as well
I
later
mean,
on.
if you're a
That
managing director, and or an owner, like in my case, I'm a site owner. Your title could be whatever you want. At the end of the day, you're responsible for everything, and business development is a huge part of it. It's
absolutely. You
you
have to say,
cannot stop a business dev
yeah,
selling. Selling is fundamental. And I think that's a skill set that everyone would benefit from. Philip, I want to ask, in your case, now that you have the benefit of hindsight, right, and analysis, do you think the PhD helped you at all, or do you think it's obviously it's going to help you because when you're a PhD and you have that doctorate behind your name, especially in our industry, people kind of take you more seriously. Oh, this person,
I would,
highly
for
educated.
that part, I would 100% agree. People talk to you more specifically if you on LinkedIn, if you write or wherever, if
Hmm.
you write to a C position
Yeah,
or to a doctor. I think just the sheer likelihood of somebody answering is higher.
I think so
That's
too.
that's the simple answer in terms of um, whether it's valuable in the business.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the same here in the United States. But from a pragmatic standpoint, do you think it's necessary to do what you currently do today?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not. But I would never look at it that way. The education as a PhD has certainly changed how I approach problems.
Mm,
Because essentially, if you're working on a PhD, let's say between 2 and 5 years, for me, I think it was three and something, you're spending a lot of time thinking about how to basically come up with a good hypothesis and how to essentially check whether it's true. And that's sometimes an advantage because it's a very methodical approach to problem solving. It can be a disadvantage because sometimes I think it's better. And that's what I say. You lose a bit if you have that hard training. It's better to come up with a quick answer. And I think if you don't do a PhD, probably and spend more time in business and practice, it might be the case that you're more wired towards that quick and swift answering and addressing of a problem because you haven't gone through the training of that is the approach. You have to do it methodically. Please check that all the chapters that are expected in the paper are taken account for. um, I think that can be a hindrance. Whether what influence it has really, it has become part of who I am. So that's how I do things, right? And I can't change that in a, let's say, meaningful way, right?
of
I don't.
course, of course. There
That's
is
how I would answer it.
That's a great
It's a
answer.
personal choice.
That's a great answer. The reason I ask is because there are a lot of people that watch and listen. By the way, you guys can all connect with Philip. His LinkedIn is underneath this video or in the show notes if you're listening. There's a large segment of my viewership or audience that think that they're struggling to get their next job because they don't have more education, right? These are master's levels people, and they think that the solution is actually more education. And I don't, like you said, I don't think it's that clean to where PhD equals guaranteed success in your next job. But I do think it's a great tool if you do want to actually get it, if you want to pursue it for more reasons than just it's going to help me get my next job because I'm struggling right now.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of the wrong approach, in my opinion, to go. And not to mention, you're going to get a lot of debt. Here in the US, it's not cheap to get a PhD
Go to
degree.
Europe.
Or in
It's-
Europe, I'm imagining, yeah. So that's why I ask. It's because I don't have a problem with people doing it like you did early on or after their careers established. I have a problem when people are having issues already getting careers, getting a job, and thinking automatically it's the reason why. because we've been trained to think that way by society because they benefit off of your student loans.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. So I said it's a personal choice because it
Mhm.
it really depends on what you want to achieve. If you want to become a professor, there's no choice. You have to do a PhD.
Yeah.
If you want to do something else, it really depends of what your personal goal is and whether you want to achieve it, whether in that story it's important for you to have a PhD to be satisfied. What I see a lot, and I think I have gone through the same thing. I don't know how it is for people that are starting their careers today, but it feels like education becomes also a question of consumption, right? So there's so many offers that
Mhm.
kind of promise you if you consume this and also this education, you will get a better chance at getting a job. I'm not sure that is something that the industry that sells these education programs is making you believe because they want to sell. I agree. It's right, absolutely the point you're making, and that also I think is the reason why I think in the US was Peter Thiel who came up with the idea of saying just drop, don't do nothing, just go into the apprenticeship essentially of a career early on. And in Germany, we have these apprenticeships that are essentially 3 years on the job with a little educational component that are disappearing a bit too. But they're much more focused on the craft and instead of the education, because there are two things. If I would say, has the education helped me in my daily business? Yes, I can read a balance sheet and stuff like that. I learned. Has the education helped me in questions? How do I lead a team? What is leadership and so on in a way that I think is actually um, is actually applicable to the job? No, I've learned a lot of theories, but I think I would change like a business administration program in a way that I say, let's do some theater and imitate probably some discussions with your boss or imitate situations where you have to lead a team where people act out stuff. That would be
Mm.
much more helpful and much more practical. But that's not what is really done. Sorry, very extensive answer to your question.
No, but this is good. So in running the CRO in your day-to-day running Peleos, about leadership, because this is a topic that it's something I do as well with my sites. What is your style? What kind of style do you have when it comes to managing your team?
Well, not surprisingly, given that I did the PhD and I would say I'm a more technical person. I would say I try to be very structured and say technical, um, clearly technical leadership style, right? In terms of saying, this is the structure, please follow the structure. Yeah, not like, how could you call it? Not like a very um, out of the stomach kind of leadership style,
Okay.
right? I hope that was clear enough.
That's very clear. So I think you and I would make good business partners because I'm kind of the opposite. Um, when it and I'm training people at my companies to be leaders themselves. And I think the way you scale is train everyone really to be a leader because we're in the growing stage. And I know that eventually we're going to have to replicate this model if we become a site network at other locations. And they're going to look at our site where they're going to be hopefully the flagship site and people are going to emulate from us. So I tell all my staff, hey, you need to focus on leadership. And, they probably think I'm just like saying something for the heck of it, but really it is. And one of the things I've learned is being like a servant leader more. So there's a really good book by the San Francisco 49ers coach Bill Walsh, and he said the score takes care of itself. So if you establish a good culture, everything
Mhm.
from how you take out the trash, how you answer the phone, how you show up with your clothes, that culture is going to dictate in the long run the outcomes. Regardless of how you can put any kind of personality to lead. If the culture is correct or the right one, the outcomes are going to come. And so I've been really fascinated with this idea of culture. Jordan Peterson even said, we're both parents or soon to be. Parents are to children as culture is to an organization. And if you look at it from that perspective, it becomes a little bit more clear, at least to me, because I shoot from the hip. I'm not technical. I'm not, I don't have a PhD, but ultimately we're striving for the same thing, really, is having a scalable system, scalable framework that brings order to the chaos. And you
Yeah.
could go about it different ways, but at the end of the day, we're both building a culture, and I think that's really the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I fully agree. There's this saying, was it Peter Drucker? I'm not sure, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast.
There is true.
You can come up with the greatest plans ever if you don't have a clear culture of how you're going to achieve it. And it's not something written, it's how you do it. Um,
Yes.
will not succeed. And I think that's something, I have been in this company for a while now. And, looking at how Renate, my, now former boss, um, led the company. As you say, telling somebody, look, this is how you lead, and doing it yourself and feeling what it means is something probably like parenthood, very different. You have ideas about how it is, you have probably plans of how to do it, but then you realize you had no idea. Because to live it is a different thing than to think it, right? And I think that is
Yes.
something that is very true. And that is also something that is very hard to prepare people for. You kind of have to dip your toes in the water and more, in the cold water, and then see how you personally deal with it. Because only then I think you can find an authentic way to present yourself how you feel comfortable and you want to do things. And people have to understand this first to be able to understand what is your culture like, right?
Yeah,
And to find that out, I think is an important part of becoming a leader, of being a leader and working on reflecting how are you actually leading.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and finding your own path to achieve that goal. It can be very different,
Sure.
as you would probably approach it very differently, from the gut, saying this is how I feel right and this is how I do it, while I think about it a weekend and say, okay, this is probably the best structural approach. Um, and so I think, yeah, that is what I would say about leadership. Find your own path. Don't be shy experimenting a bit about what works and what doesn't. I think you have to take some risks and fail to understand better what you are like. If you don't, probably it will be very difficult to convince other people.
Yeah, I mean, the business, just like a child is going to take. I was having a conversation with some parent people yesterday giving me advice on parenting, and they said, the child's a reflection of you. We always know how the parents are by looking at the child. Like
Yes.
you don't care what the parents tell you how they are. You can see it in the reflection of their offspring. I mean, and same thing with a business, really. Like if your company has a culture where nobody really cares or toxic, you know, that's a direct reflection of the leadership. And one of my favorite quotes before we move into CROs and kind of where you see that industry headed, Mike Tyson said everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that that's a perfect way to summarize this because whether you have this culture or that culture, you have these strategies, it doesn't matter. The industry is harsh. And where do you think it's actually going? Because Philip, CRO, I don't know if you've been reading the headlines. They're like, at least here in the US, and I want to get your take on this. The sponsors, there's a movement of sponsors to have a more involved relationship with their sites. As a site owner, I'm seeing it anecdotally. In the past, 10 years ago, and I had my sites, I didn't care who the sponsor was. Is IQVIA? I want to do good because I want to get more study from IQVIA. Now it's
Yeah.
the opposite. I don't care who the CRO. I truly don't care who the CRO is. I care who the sponsor is. It Eli Lilly? It's the same thing, but opposite now. It's about the sponsor. And
Mhm.
there's a growing sentiment in the space that CROs are going to have to radically evolve as site networks get bigger. And I don't know how it is in Europe with site networks, but usually what happens here happens there.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this, like running the CRO? Because I'm sure you've thought about it and you've heard similar things.
So I would say I'm not a specialist on site networks, so it's not my expertise for sure. But just by looking at, the big conferences I visit, uh, for example, ASCO, right, in
Hmm.
Chicago, and comparing it to, for example, which, similar conference in oncology in Europe, not the same size, but still very big. I think what's absolutely noticeable is that site networks in the US play a much bigger role just by their presence. And I think what's happening, I'm not sure how this will turn out, but I think what's happening is that site networks have come up because sites became more professionalized. I think before CROs organized sites in a way that they would be compatible with clinical trials because they were more focused on treating patients, according to standard of care. That was the hospital's job. And then here, at least in Germany, they started to have like specific site departments, but then that's not the right word, but just like a section of the hospital just doing clinical trials. And obviously, the next reasonable way to grow as a hospital is to also take care of the processes that, and use that to make money that a CRO would take over. So taking care of IT, taking care of data quality, any kind of job that you could take on as a site, recruitment, whatever. I think there are 1,000 things you have a much better touch on as a site to ensure quality than you have as a CRO because it's your own employees. So you can use that as a value proposition. It looks like that happened in the US.
Happening, not happening.
It's still happening?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes, yeah. It's just the beginnings of it. There's only like two or three site networks actually capable of pulling it off to the extent that they're investing in technology systems like even their own ePros, and even now they're just adding a layer of monitoring maybe on top of what they do. But these are
Yeah.
people, and they recruit the people from that used to work at the CROs too. I mean, they have hundreds of millions, at their disposal. So money is not even an obstacle anymore like it used to be.
Yeah. And given that they have direct access to the patients and they actually know what recruitment potential can be
Yeah,
achieved. I
yeah.
think that is the key for them to control, um, or the key value proposition even I think they have. Because as a CRO, basically you're relying on the investigator to tell whoever you ask, right? The
Yeah, all those
study
soft
manager or
skills. Let
whoever,
me
you're
enter
relying
the
on
data.
them to provide the information on the feasibility. And they will, by experience, not always tell you the truth. You would probably sometimes find out that the numbers are a bit lower than expected,
Oh, they lie in Germany too?
or there's a competing study that was coming, and so on and so forth. They have their own interests, and they act according to their interest. Yeah, so I think that might come up as well. So I think for the CRO, the CRO will that's my idea, will be more and more responsible to be, I wouldn't say a broker, but essentially be I can talk about it in IT terms, the
Mhm.
middleware, right? So essentially, it will be about understanding the infrastructure of the site or the SMO, understanding the drug development aspect, understanding different regions, so the strategic regulatory aspects, because that is not something that I think makes sense for an SMO to build up. Then you become a CRO. And I think the key positioning that a CRO has to make in the future is to get that understanding and provide a strategic value proposition to the sponsor, while working with the strength of site networks or specific sites and making use of technology to bring together the data exchange aspects between all parties because you have data flows from labs, from the sites, um, I don't know, from suppliers, whoever is involved in this trial. And I think the key question and the key challenge for a CRO is to be as efficient as possible, to have a normalized, standardized data structure to be efficient in terms of quality management while the trial is running, but also efficient in terms of the readout. So having the right data structures in place to have an efficient readout. And I think having that understanding, having basically a plug and play system for the different systems is where the CRO can arbitrage. Because if you're not a big pharma company and can essentially afford to do everything yourself, you're a mid-sized biotech, they want to deal with their research usually, right? They don't want to deal with the operations. They want to buy some study essentially and say, look, provide me with the results, do everything you need to do so I can essentially move forward my research and find out whatever the question currently is, and reach my investment goals for the shareholders, for the people that have invested in myself and the company, or for the registration I'm seeking. So I think that will be more the pressure that CROs have to become that middleware, to be able to adapt different solutions and plug in into different systems, to be able to be the flexible partner of sponsors.
Yeah. Do you think it becomes because at the same time AI is growing in importance in every industry and this one for sure. This data, the more data we generate, the more structured data we have, eventually becomes fuel for sponsors to use to their liking, right? They can then create systems on top of it and essentially make their next study a little bit more efficient and this race towards efficiency. The data is really the CROs would like to be in that role of siloing it and leasing it out more or less, right? Or you have
Yeah.
access to your data sponsor, but it's not really yours, it's ours, but it's you have access to it. But you they don't necessarily have access to run AI through it, maybe. There's gonna be this whole debate about who owns the data. And there's some data the sponsor's going to own. It's clear that it's theirs, but there's this huge gray area where you can argue, well, this is actually the CRO proprietary data. And where
Yeah.
do you stand on this? And like, how do you see this logically playing itself out in the next 5, 10 years? Because what's
Very
preventing
good
growth
question.
now in AI is access to more data, right? To good data.
Yeah, I think there are two dimensions to this. I think the first one is the access to information, and the second one is the processing of information, which is more operational a question. So let me explain what I mean. For example, if you're like Paleos was as in the beginning, a German focus CRO, you're well aware of how the German market works, what sites you can speak to them in German. You know, there's some pathways to get to information if you want to do a clinical trial. Now, if you want to expand to France or the US or even, I don't know, Kazakhstan, the information access becomes more problematic. You have to spend much more energy, much more time. You don't even know the language to understand how do I run a trial and is it feasible to run the trial in that specific country. If you look like simply at today's situation, um, you can go and chat GPT, use the newest version, and ask, what is the standard of care in this country? Upload the trial anonymously, without showing anything, or just the endpoints or the inclusion criteria, just even the inclusion. And if you're somewhat versed with how to write good prompts and understand clinical trials, you can get not a perfect answer, but a pretty good answer and assessment on whether it's feasible to do the trial. So what difference does it make? it makes a huge difference because then, if you understand, you can go to France and say, look, I look for a freelancer that is somewhat known in the industry, or even a CRO, and say, look, we want to contract you. We know this and this is the situation. Can you do it? That would have been much more difficult and much more time consuming. Probably some people wouldn't even have tried before AI. And I think that will only accelerate with specialized solution. I'm talking about a generalized solution based on internet information that you need to confirm with somebody who knows it. But that's the first thing. So the barrier of entry, I think, is lowered because the information is much more accessible. So that's one thing that will increase the competition by quite a bit because now you don't have these big moats of information essentially in that specified industry because the standardized information is pretty much accessible and we are in the in the child age of this. It's been two
Sure.
years since OpenAI launched their model. Um, or is it 1 year? I'm not sure, but it's short time.
Right.
So we forget how recent this is. If you look at the internet, how long it took forever compared to it. Here, pew, it's going up. I think the second is the information processing. So I think AI will play a role there as well, and it will probably favor the larger companies first. So look at any CRO, any sponsor. They have a huge number of SOPs, some information collected in whatever form, Excel, databases, and so on. There's no one in that company that has access and awareness of all this knowledge. If you can manage, and people are doing this in larger companies, I know this, and I've known people that have built it, basically build a GPT for their company with access to all these documents, closed access. Then you can feed this AI, it's not an AI, it's GPT model, this large language model. You can feed it with all kinds of information that is relevant specifically to your expertise, but you can harness it much quicker and much better. And with additional applications built up on this and plugging in certain applications like a CTMS, and you have a little chatbot just to ask you, have we done this trial before? What did people say? Blah. You can ask any question that is reasonable. A company that does this will be much more efficient. Someone who, how did we do this again? We can ask, who did decide this? Like you have at your ready and available, you at your like fingertips, probably later just talking to the bot. These answers, you can have a conversation with the past essentially of the company. So I think that will change a lot on these two fronts. So barriers of entry will be lower. There will be players that will use these tools and just because they're quicker and make use of efficiencies that they see to be better than current players because they're too slow implementing it or adopting it. And then like within, there will be companies just leveraging AI just internally to use their existing processes, know-how, people, and so on and so forth, to be much quicker in the decision making and in creating documents and just gathering this vast amount of information distributed amongst many people, documents, and systems into one system that I can interact with. And I don't know what the result will be, but it will fundamentally change every business we worldwide live in, but certainly also our business. What will not change as quickly, we still have to treat patients. And that is a biological process that will also benefit, but it will benefit much slower. That's what I also learned in the business since then. I came from IT. You go in and say, look, let's use all this stuff. And you realize there's a lot of processes for quality management, for validation, and so on, that make sure that before you do that, it is actually, in a sense, validated to work as intended and doesn't give false results. So it will be interesting to see how, let's say, the more non-treating side, let's say the processing side of the business evolves, while the patients still need to be treated for, I don't know, 12 weeks according to the protocol and so on. So that will be a given, right? Developing a drug takes a lot of time. So we will have an interaction between the real biological world and the impact that in terms of process speed and knowledge integration, will have on that specific development. Probably less
Sure,
mistakes, more efficiency, but
sure.
still gotta do the trials.
Yeah, I think there the rate determining step is you can't speed up the biological processes yet, at least. I mean, there's people talking about having a digital twins and things like that, but we're so far removed from that. But what's much closer is this agency work, because what you described is the AI evolving into agency work. And
Yeah.
so, which job? Okay, patient interaction. I think the coordinators are safe, relatively speaking. I mean, if you've got a needle in a patient's vein, you're pretty intimate with the patient. Like the AI is not going to do that. If you're on the phone with the patient, convincing them to come in, you're pretty intimate with them. Patient trusts you. You're not a machine, you're a human. What about CRAs? What do you think CRAs are still needed? And as many as we have in the past few decades.
I think the number of CRAs will be lower.
Wow.
Because what I've seen from the past is that coming from 100% SDV, which you know takes more time, obviously, than to moving to risk-based monitoring, which I'm not sure whether it actually has decreased because I think the role has changed a bit. You just don't go to the site as often because the data has shown it's not necessary. But you still have to do a lot of site management, working with the site, keeping the relationship, because they're humans that have to prioritize work themselves. And just by experience, the CRA with the best relationship to the sites gets the best results. So there's a human component. But what I'm getting to is, at least in Germany, I think the US is more advanced in this regard. The direct integration of electronic health records
Mhm.
with the clinical systems isn't really advancing. I have not seen much work on this that really changes the fundamental way of doing clinical trials. That would be no person involved in the first check. Everything is transferred from the clinical system to from the electronic health record at the hospital to the clinical database or some other database in between, and then the check is done after in alignment with the clinic with the hospital information system. I haven't seen this. I don't know what the case is, whether something is happening there in the US. I know a couple of pilot projects,
At the
but nothing
academic
really had
medical center.
materialized.
Have you heard of YonaLink? I just did a podcast yesterday with YonaLink. They
No,
do
I don't.
this. They do this. EHR to EDC integration. It's pretty impressive. I have not used them. We're a small community-based site. Not all of our EHRs are the same.
Mhm.
They vary from PI to PI, and not all of our patients are actually patients of a PI. They're sometimes from advertisements, but they have a solution for this as well. They're building their own kind of middleware
Mhm.
in between the sites and the EHRs, and they're having a repository. So once a patient's in, they kind of have access to everything, like a tree branch, you know. And I mean, to me, this stuff is fascinating, man. But so you definitely think you're the first one to be that bold to say we might need less CRAs, and that's kind of everyone's suspicion, but no one really has said it yet. But there's
I,
also a
I
world where we need more.
So let me expand a bit. So I think every industrial revolution, and we can go into that. I think internet plus AI, you never realize when you're in it, but it kind of is an industrial or digital revolution.
Of
If it
course.
goes the path that they think it does, it is one. It is not never, also with the industrial revolution, it has never been the question of is this job disappearing or is it not disappearing? What usually happened is that, yeah, jobs are disappearing because other jobs become important. So maybe the CRA of today is doing some other job, fixing some different issue. And
Yeah.
it's just another job description because the essential question of making sure that quality is upheld um, is at a different spot, right? It's not with the data
Yeah.
anymore because that specific data transfer or data entry from one system to the other is not a source of error anymore. But it
Hmm.
might be at another place where there's a source of error that needs addressing of a human. Maybe the person is sitting there with some agent finding out some, or looking at some behavioral patterns of the site that might allude to some process problem. I don't know,
I was
right?
just gonna get into that because, okay, I it's only anecdotes. I tell you, I go from the hip. I read plenty of things, but I've been a site owner for 20 years in different parts of the country. Well, really just the Southwest, California, Arizona, but enough sites, enough PIs, enough studies, hundreds to see the shift. When I started in 2005, all the CRAs, not just some of them, all of them, their skill set was that they were very robotic. They came in, they're like a honed in on something, they go find it. That gradually, and they were not personal. For the most part, they were not personable. It was very rare when you had one that was like, "Hey Dan, how are you doing?" Empathy, EQ was not really prioritized. It was basically be a AI.
Uh-huh.
As this is evolving, I'm noticing they've been hiring mostly for empathy, mostly to be like a kind of a psychologist for the sites. Like the CRO, the sponsor's hiring you, hey, we need to figure out, we already know they're behind on data queries. We know they have a lot of deviation. We already know that. We need to find out why, and we need to find out like how to fix this. So it's exactly what you said that I've kind of observed anecdotally. Like they're much more persuasive people now as opposed to robotic. And I think that is kind of congruent with what you've said about getting into the heads of the sites. It's interesting if we're gonna need actually more people to do that role than we currently have. I mean, that's a complicated. You want to get into a coordinator's head? I try to do it every day. It's messy in there. Like,
Yeah, very
you may
human.
need more people.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that aspect I think makes it very hard to predict what's going to happen. The only thing that you can read from the past is that jobs change, and not in a linear way. Jobs disappear, they will be taken over by machines.
Mm,
Well, historically speaking, machines have also um, to be configured, they have to be managed, and somebody has to use them. And so while somebody might not pick the grains with their hands, they use a machine, and that machine has to be driven. That machine has to be maintained. That machine has to be managed in some way or shape.
mm.
Totally different job, but still another job, right? With a higher productivity. So very difficult to say how it turns out. And that's why I'm saying the patients still have to be treated. And I don't see robots treating the patients very soon.
No,
So there needs to be an interaction that a machine cannot do with the site that understands the patients, how the patients feel, how to, all that things. So it might be that the site coordination, contact to the site will take on a more important role than even more than you just mentioned.
right.
Just by the fact that other things that were in the focus of attention before because it was the main source of problems because the quality wasn't there before they're not the focus anymore because they're not problems where efficiency lie elsewhere. So you focus on these aspects. And I'm not sure what they're going to be, but they will be there, I'm sure.
Yeah, I have a feeling they're gonna be more like EQ versus IQ because the IQ is gonna be commoditized. I mean, and intelligence has a ceiling of diminishing returns, but wisdom, not so much. I think wisdom is infinite, and the ROI is infinite on that too. So that's where you still need the humans, because it's one thing to say the AIs and the agency can replace intellect, maybe, but wisdom is a kind of a compl that's the domain of humans still for the time
Yeah.
being.
Yeah. I agree. Well, when no one knows when we have actually full general artificial intelligence, but if you believe, what's the guy's name? He wrote about a singularity, and he's
Ah,
saying,
Kurzweil.
yes.
Yeah.
I was starting to read his books to understand better where he's coming from because I thought the concept is interesting. And he's saying, like in the next couple of years.
Yeah, they're saying that. I'm not so sure, but you know what's a very good thought experiment is if you try to look 100 years, even though it's possible. That's precisely why it's interesting. Don't think our grandkids, is it 100 years? Maybe our great grandkids. I don't think they deal with these things. I think at that point, we may not need patience because of in silica. Maybe
Yeah,
the AI can get the biological processes to speed up
yeah,
reliably, right?
yeah.
Because science is just about, is it reliable? If you make a variation, is it going to be the same? Is it
This
hard to
is
make the
simulated.
variation? Exactly. So you're not going to have a need for patient, just access to their, whatever, biometric, everything, epigenome, all that stuff. Then you won't need coordinators. Then you won't need really CRAs. It'll just be agents doing agents. It's gonna be a whole new world. So even though this stuff looks intimidating now and there's people worried about their jobs, we're still very much dependent on people. And I don't think that's changing in at least our lifetime. I think you and I retire and there's still human beings kind of doing pretty similar to what we're doing now. It's just maybe different, like you said, and faster and maybe more. There's still human involved in every step of the process, and maybe even more than we have now.
Yeah,
But I'm an
I'm not even
optimist.
sure about that because if you look at the pace of change, I think there's some material limit to produce stuff and
Mm,
things like that. But the pace of things changing in the last 10 years in terms of automated self-driving, in terms of just the general AI models. I'm not sure whether we are getting the exponentiality of growth. It's very hard to grasp for humans because we are always thinking pretty much hard to think in a straight line. Things will develop as quickly as they were in the past. But if we're accelerating, and I think that's what's Kurzweil's main argument,
yeah,
then we underestimate the rate of change. And so, given the rate of change we had, and it accelerating so quickly in the last 100 years, I mean, imagine what happened in the last 100 years, even like 150. I wonder sometimes whether our imagination is sufficient to realize what's happening. There's an interesting, it's not paintings, I think it's postcards from the World Exhibition in 1890. When was it in Paris? 96? I don't remember. In the 1900s. And the task was, or the idea was to show how things would look like in the future. And so they would have flying trains. And like, the imagination was there that things would fly and people would beam themselves and stuff like that.
yeah,
But the way it works, they didn't have that imagination, right? So the
yeah,
concept of flying applied to things that they knew, but they didn't have the imagination of how it would actually turn out because that is something that the fantasy wasn't enough. You only apply to what you know currently.
correct.
And
Well,
so,
there's
yeah.
also theories that, I mean, we forget that we're within a societal framework and a very political framework and regulatory and or dogma. Regulatory is something relatively new, but dogma, orthodoxy, there's argument that we should have had a real Renaissance instead of a mini one in the 1400s, in
Mhm.
Florence and with the Medici's, but the church kind of stifled that growth. Same thing in the 1800s, it was really nation states kind of doing it. And now you're seeing it with this, for whatever you want to call it, regulatory burden, which basically limits the rate of growth. And AI is going to be definitely under the influence of regulatory control. So it's not just in a vacuum. which is why I'm slowing it down a bit. Not to mention the LLMs do have a limit themselves. Like if you listen, I'm sure you do to the experts. There's a de diminishing rate of returns the higher up you get. It's not just computing power, and it's the data itself is no longer good. Like you ran out of data,
Yeah,
right? Which is why I was talking to you about CROs. I think the next phase really is siloing or collecting these data, structured data for the next wave, but it's really
yeah,
like preparing the infrastructure for eventually that AGI. So that's why looking forward, I think it's slower than we expect, maybe, or what these Kurzweil futurists expect. But I mean, I certainly could be wrong too. I don't know. I mean, you get into philosophy basically
yeah,
because human thoughts are fungible until consciousness makes them. It's kind of like a particle, a wave or a particle. Uh, Consciousness is the observer, and you get sparks of idea all the time. So do I, but we get much more of our time as just random thoughts superimposed everywhere, and we're not aware of it. So I think the AI with the data is kind of similar. What are you going to do with all this? Well, it doesn't make sense till you like compute, focus energy, resources on something. It's not just going to spontaneously do it. And
yeah.
the,
You
that's
have to
where I
write the
think the
right.
limits are.
You have to write to go back to the simple stuff. You have to write the right prompt to get a good answer.
There you go. And that's the analogy of that is like machine consciousness, basically, right? It's just in our human cases, that happens by our control and sometimes not control. With the AIs, it's human depends on making that happen. So, and then regulatory kind of has a big role in that. But we need to definitely do like a part two and a part three. But as far as Paleos is concerned, like who do you guys, as we wrap up, you do a lot of oncology. Are there other indications that you guys work on as
Yeah,
well?
we're pretty much agnostic. So it's about 25% oncology. That's where Paleos is coming from. Um, then we have, let's say, in the middle single digit numbers, the big indications, right? So inflammatory,
Ah,
um, you have gastroenterology, what else? Yeah, cardiology, whatever. That like the
ooh,
big indications.
nice.
We have them as well, so that translates into like, two-digit number of trials we have done. But we have done over 100 oncology trials, so that is really our forte. I think it's a good space to be in, um, because it's the disease of our current civilizations becoming older.
Yes.
Very difficult to treat one. And I think it's amazing if you look, in the 1990s and 1980s, um, at the overall survival rates and how they have changed besides a couple of ones that are still problematic. That's amazing achievement for patients. So I think it's always worth looking at the survival rates back then for like the big ones like breast cancer, where you were at 60, 70 percent. And now you're like in the treatable ones, you're actually in the realm of a disease that is pretty much treatable
Yeah.
in terms of having a long time survival of more than of 10 years, and it's up to 95 and more percent. So
And that's really where I mean, we'd get into philosophy and romanticism and or dystopianism, however you want to look at the future. But I think what we have that's pragmatic in front of us is disease, cancer, Alzheimer. I mean, these are the big moonshots that we really should all be focused on before we think about how do we replace a CRA or how do we replace a coordinator. We need to focus on how do we get rid of cancer? How do we at least make the lives longer, survival rates increase. I think this is, I hope, where the industry is going to be headed. I think where the money is going. So, as long as there is that need, I think that our industry is relatively safe. This kind of external technology. I do think they're going to be more agency work than replacements because of the
yeah,
glaring need in our in our industry. And with the new regimes coming in, hopefully they understand that these things are super important. And I think they do, at least in the
You mean
US.
Trump?
Yeah, I mean, listen, what RFK is trying to do is basically take a huge active role on healthcare, even though
True.
people may not agree with him. That's irrelevant, really. He sees the problem. And the problem is multifaceted. It is cultural. It's not just this treatment. It's what's the lifestyle looking like. And, that's going to take generation to kind of figure out.
Yeah,
But
and
clinical trial is still going to.
it's a lot of behavioral aspects. I think, who did I see? I think it was the CEO of Novartis who was talking about that when talking about the role of apps and just any instrument that will track and potentially influence behavior of people um, to better understand what the behavioral factor in whatever disease you're treating is, besides the pure mechanism of action of a certain drug and influencing some biological and biochemistry aspects. He had a talk about that, which I thought was fascinating. That you go into from the sheer treatment to also adding on to that the behavioral aspects of a human being that have an influence on how that disease is created in the first place, treated secondly, and then looked after when it has been treated. So
It's
yeah,
huge. It's
yeah.
huge. Even these GLP-1s, right? We do a lot of these studies on obesity, and the PIs I talk to, they're saying, what's interesting is this is a mental thing just as much as it is a physiological, metabolic thing. And we see the patients not wanting to give up their food to the extent that they will skip a dose in order to enjoy like a unhealthy meal. And
Okay,
so
wow.
you can't, no matter how good the GLP is, you're not gonna solve that problem, I think, with a simple solution like that.
Yeah,
Even though it's good and it works and they know it works, but I like to eat too. And like, so this week I'm gonna skip my shot because there's a party and I don't want to have a diarrhea and upset stomach. I want to enjoy myself. And that's kind of what RFK is getting at is the root, I believe, of the issues, which is not going to be an easy solution.
yeah, obviously not. Yeah. So, with regards to Paleos, to add on, right? So, focus on oncology, but agnostic essentially in the diagnosis, in the indication. I think to summarize, what our sweet spot, I would consider our sweet spot is. I mean, we are a mid-sized company, right? So, our like most probable partner and what I think is the most efficient partner to work with in terms of a client is a company that has pretty much the same size. We ourselves have had the experience of working with big pharma, where you have a lot of functional aspects that are not detailed or not broken down as much with us, right? So you're sitting with 10 people and they have 40 to exaggerate, right? So I think we are a good partner for biotech, a company that has in a range of 5 to 40, 50, 60 people, and wants to have access to management because their project is a priority. We are not in a structure where you win a project, it gets attributed a project manager, and then it's part of the hundreds of project manager teams that manage the projects without having contact to the leadership team because they're not
Mm,
involved in that level of
mm,
management. And I think also what we can do well is for a biotech, finding a good mix in terms of cost efficiencies because we are, in Eastern Europe, but also in Central and Western Europe, and also a good access to patient populations that are probably not existing in Western and Central Europe because it's either advanced in treatment, right? So, for example, for biosimilars, sometimes you get the newest treatments here by paid by the insurance. So people will it's less likely that they will subscribe for such, the fifth biosimilar in that area.
right.
Um, it will just not be a competitive or interesting trial for investigator. Well, in Eastern Europe, in some countries, this might not be the case. You will have a certain number of people in the population that are not having access standard of care to these newer compounds. So it could be interesting, right? So I think that is a great mix that we can offer and that we do usually when company approaches and say, look, we have this regulatory pathway. We want to do a trial. Phase two, phase three is mostly the typical trial that we do, and phase one, but don't have a phase one unit. So we outsource the phase one unit work, sort of healthy volunteer work, to third parties that do that, like focus on that aspect.
Sure. But thank God for the
And
small biotech and the mid-sized biotech.
sorry?
Thank God for the small and mid-sized
Yeah.
biotechs. That's we talked about all these what the big pharma likes, and structured data for the next 10 years but the small mid-sized biotechs, they have usually just one product, one platform,
Yeah.
and if they don't make that, there is no future. Like that's all in on that right now.
Yes.
So they're the
Correct.
least likely to say, "Hey, Paleos, we want to actually collaborate on the data so we can learn from it." Thank God for them, because that's really where the innovation's coming from.
Yeah, with the speed that they do and the flexibility they have, and also the pressure to find solutions.
Yeah,
Um, I think the big pharma guys that are most of the time then licensing, partnering, buying them
exactly.
out anyway, they're benefiting from that. So, yeah, I think it's a good area of the business to be in. It's interesting. And it's also interesting because you cover so much of the strategic aspect, right? Because they want to usually focus on their science in terms of, getting the product out and talking about the mechanism and how it improves treatment. That the operational aspect usually sometimes is not their expertise. So I think it's a good combination of providing the operational expertise while having an understanding of their drug development pathway and the logic that they want to apply to develop their drug and where they think the place of the drug should be. And I think that is like the best place to be when you have an understanding of their path. You have a good solution operationally for, their pathway in terms of the regionality, but also in terms of the budget. And I think that's where we currently find good success.
Well, Philip, we gotta obviously do a part two and three. If you ever need a site, if you ever need sites in the US, let me know.
Sure.
Multi-therapeutic. We'll
We can
chat.
have a conversation about that. We're actually looking at the US right now because obviously a lot of companies are looking to Europe because the site fees in the US are very expensive.
Yes, yes.
So it is sometimes attractive for US companies to go to Europe, even to use Eastern Europe, to get parts of the data.
Yeah.
First.
That's part of the private equity getting involved in the sites, right? When you got owners of basketball teams that are also owning PE firms that own site network, they're not so interested in working for peanuts. But we'll
Okay.
talk a little bit after Philip. Everyone go connect with him right now from Paleos Healthcare. His LinkedIn profile is underneath the video and in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll do it again.
Thank you, Dan. It was a pleasure having me. And yeah, looking forward to the next one. Maybe on philosophy this time.
Absolutely. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Bye bye.